Durwood Lucas has been treasurer at the Wildwood True Bible Church of Jesus Christ non-affiliated for a long, long time. But he's been a farmer even longer. Hard-working man. A man who believes in wasting nothing, which is one of the reasons they like having him as treasurer of the church. He especially doesn't believe in wasting time. So when Labor Day comes around every fall, he thinks it's a pretty silly idea for a holiday. You don't honor your work by not working, he says. So almost every Labor Day you can find him out working in his fields, in his barns, in his garden. But recently, on one of these recent Labor Days, it just rained and rained and rained. It rained so hard that he couldn't work outside at all. He went into his barn to see if there was something to do in there, but like I said, he was so hard working, everything was already done. And he found himself wandering into the house, where he discovered his wife watching Jerry Lewis's Labor Day telethon. Jerry Lewis was raising millions of dollars for the Muscular Dystrophy Association. He and his wife sat there and watched that, and it sort of reminded them of those Sunday nights long ago when they used to sit down and they'd watch Ed Sullivan. There were some of those same old magicians and jugglers and comedians that they hadn't seen for years. But the thing that interested Durwood Lucas the most about this telethon was how Ed McMahon would interrupt the proceedings every few minutes and say, "Look at this," and there'd be a drum roll and the numbers would spin on the tote board and go higher and higher. And it all touched some place deep inside Durwood Lucas, who had been pinching church pennies for all those years. And he began to put a plan together. The plan took shape as he bounced around over his farm on his old tractor the next few weeks, and finally he called a special meeting of the trustees of the Wildwood True Bible Church of Jesus Christ non-affiliated. It turned out at the last minute that Pastor Billy Mitchell was unable to attend this meeting because Mavis Alma Tucker called him and said she desperately needed to talk to him. Mavis Alma had lived alone for years on what is called a fixed income. She had one child, a daughter, who lived out in Tucson. When Pastor Billy got to her place, Mavis Alma tearfully told him that her daughter's husband had just been laid off from a job he had had for years. Their daughter, Mavis Alma's only grandchild, was supposed to start college the next year, and their old car was barely running, and they had called Mavis Alma up, sounding just desperate. She wanted Pastor Billy to look over her budget, to see if there was anything she could do, any way she could cut down on her expenses to help her family. She wanted him to go over it with a fine-tooth comb and point out any waste, any luxury that she could cut out. Pastor Billy took the legal pad on which Mavis Alma had scribbled out her monthly income and expenses, and he was astonished that anyone could live on so little. Her house was neat as a pin. She was tastefully dressed. She even served him hot tea in old family china. But he could not imagine how she stretched that money to eat and keep up her car and afford gas to drive to church even. He told her she could not afford to spare any money, but that the church had a Good Samaritan fund. He was sure he could squeeze something out of it for her daughter, though secretly he wasn't sure there was very much left in it. And he promised to pray for her and for her family. They held hands, and he prayed right there over that legal pad. And Mavis Alma cried into a lace handkerchief. Meanwhile, back at the church, Durwood Lucas spelled out his new Stewardship Vision. "We have big expenses," he said, "and we have big challenges facing us. The biggest expense was clearly the pressing need to do something about the steeple rot before the steeple just fell off the church and killed somebody. And the challenge was, well, remember when Myrtle Swanson's brother-in-law filled the pulpit last July while Pastor Billy was away on his vacation? Now, Myrtle Swanson's brother-in-law was a retired Bible teacher who had just kind of grown bored, and that month of preaching so energized him that he took it as a sign from God that he should become a missionary, and he was trying to get money together to head off to Mexico. Myrtle wanted the church to help sponsor him. Durwood said this congregation has been given about $85,000 every year now for some time. We're kind of stuck there, but we can do better. We can jump to 6 digits. We can send Myrtle's brother-in-law to Mexico. We can fix that steeple rot. We can do it in one day, just like Jerry Lewis. Some of the trustees looked positively awake. The plan was that they would set a date, and they would ask every member to phone the church with their pledge on that day. Durwood himself would man the phone at the church, and he would put a big sign up out front, up high where everybody could see it, including the Baptists, with the goal of $100,000 on it, and he'd send his wife out after every phone call to post the results. We'll call it More Than Ever Before, and we can use the theme, If Jerry Lewis can do it, so can we. The trustees thought about it for a while and talked about it for a while, and finally at the end they bought the whole thing except the part about Jerry Lewis. Some of them were just uncomfortable associating a Jewish person with Jesus. The big day was just last week. The sign Durwood put up outside the church was red, white, and blue, and Durwood's own aluminum ladder was leaning up against it. Now, Constance and Joshua Greenpasture were among the first to call. Constance and Joshua Greenpasture had a kind of a small cabin out on a lake a few miles from Wildwood that they had used across the years with their children for getaways, and they'd go out there fishing, but they didn't use it much anymore. Their children had moved out to Boulder, Colorado, and they just didn't use it much anymore, and they'd been talking about selling it, and finally this year they had sold it, and when Joshua discovered how much money he could get for it, he said he wished he'd sold it years before. They were the first people to call, and they made a large donation and got things off to a very good start. Other people called across the morning, and Durwood's wife would go climb up and down the ladder with these big numbers that she had. She would hang on hooks that he'd put in that sign, and by noon they were over halfway to their goal. Traffic kind of picked up out in front of the church. People from all over town were kind of interested to see how this was going. Afternoon, things got kind of quiet, though. Durwood had planned on that. He made his own pledge afternoon, and that started things going again. Ralph Evans was among the people driving by frequently that afternoon. Ralph Evans decided when he heard this plan that he wanted to be the last pledger. He was going to be the one that would put them over the top. But he didn't want to pledge any more than he had to. So he kept a kind of careful eye on the progress that afternoon. Mavis Almer Tucker called in after her nap. Turned out her son-in-law got hired by a friend's company the next week after he was laid off. They offered him more money than he'd been making before and gave him a company car. She was so relieved and so thankful to the church for its prayers and its support that she pledged $10 a month. Durwood wrote it down in his little notebook, but he told his wife not to bother going up the ladder for just $120. It turned out Ralph Evans got the honor of making the last pledge and taking the church all the way to the goal of $100,000. And he did it by giving almost a third less money than he gave last year.